I'm sitting in my daughter's living room right now, holding a cup of coffee that's gone cold, and I still can't believe how far we've come. My name is Eunice Tate. I am 63 years old, and for 11 years my daughter believed I had abandoned her. Let me tell you how that happened. I was 42 when I married him. I know. Everybody says I should have known better at 42. Maybe they're right. But when you've spent most of your adult life raising a daughter alone, working double shifts at a hospital laundry in Memphis, Tennessee, eating peanut butter sandwiches so your child could have real food, when a man comes along who looks at you like you're worth something, you want to believe it's true. His name was Dennis Whitfield. He was 50, divorced, owned a trucking logistics company out of Nashville. He dressed well. He spoke quietly. He never raised his voice. I thought that meant he was gentle. I was wrong. The quiet ones, I've learned, can do the most damage. They're patient about it. My daughter Renata was 21 when I married him. She was finishing her last year at Tennessee State, studying nursing. She had her whole life mapped out. She didn't like Dennis from the start. She told me that at a Waffle House about a week before the wedding, pushing her eggs around her plate, not looking at me. "Mama, something about him feels off." I told her she just needed time to get used to him. I told her she'd come around. I was wrong about that too. The first 3 years weren't bad, if I'm being honest. Dennis was generous with money in ways I'd never experienced. We moved into a 4-bedroom house in Brentwood, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns look like they've been cut with scissors. I stopped working. He said I didn't have to anymore. I thought that was love. Later I understood it was control. A man doesn't want you working because a working woman has her own exit. Renata graduated, got her nursing license, moved to Atlanta for a residency program. We talked on the phone every Sunday. She never warmed to Dennis, but she tolerated him, for my sake. Then I started noticing things, small things at first. A balance on our joint checking account that didn't match what Dennis had told me. A name in his phone, Charlene, that showed up 3-4 times a week. A business trip to Louisville that lasted 6 days when he'd said it would be 3. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I'd been poor long enough that money anxiety had just gotten into my bones. Then one afternoon in January, I came home from the grocery store to find a woman sitting at my kitchen table. Not just any woman. She was maybe 35, wearing a cream-colored blouse, perfectly calm, like she'd been there 100 times. Because, I would find out later, she had. Dennis was standing at the counter. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed, like I was the one interrupting something. "Eunice," he said, "I've been meaning to talk to you." What he said next took me about 10 minutes to fully understand. He and Charlene, that was her name, Charlene Moss, had been together for 2 years. He wanted a divorce. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He was asking me to leave the house voluntarily so things could be uncomplicated. I just stood there with 2 bags of groceries in my hands. When I finally found my voice, I told him I wasn't going anywhere. That house was marital property. I had rights. I'd given up my job, my independence, moved out of the only city I'd ever known. I wasn't just walking out the door because it was convenient for him. That's when things got ugly. I don't know exactly when Dennis started laying the groundwork, but I found out later he'd been building his case against me for months before that January afternoon. He'd been telling people, his brother, his business partners, our neighbors, that I had a drinking problem, that I'd become unstable, that he'd been trying to manage my episodes quietly out of love. He had planted those seeds so carefully that when the accusation finally came, it had roots. 3 weeks after I refused to leave, Dennis filed a report with the Williamson County Sheriff's Department. He said I had threatened him with a kitchen knife. He said he feared for his life. It wasn't true. Not a word of it was true. But there was Charlene as a witness, and Dennis had a recording, something he'd clearly manipulated, cut and spliced, of me screaming at him during one of our arguments. Out of context, it sounded frightening. In context, I had just found out he'd forged my signature on a refinancing document. I was arrested on a Thursday morning, walked out of my own home in handcuffs while the next-door neighbor watched from her driveway. I called Renata from the county jail. I told her what was happening. She drove up from Atlanta that night. Bail was set, and she put up $10,000. She didn't really have to get me out. I will never forget standing in that parking lot at 11 o'clock at night, my daughter holding me while I shook. The trial took 18 months to get to. 18 months of legal fees of Dennis's lawyers filing continuance after continuance, running down my resources. I had no income. I had to move into a cousin's spare bedroom in Memphis. I sold my car. I sold jewelry Dennis had given me. The irony of that still stings. My attorney was a good woman named Faye Drummond, but she was a solo practitioner in Memphis, not a heavyweight firm, and Dennis had a team. The jury convicted me of aggravated assault, Class C felony. I was sentenced to 14 months in the Shelby County Correctional Center. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 14 months for something I did not do. I will not pretend that those 14 months were something I can describe easily. I will just say this: there is a specific kind of grief that comes from being locked up for something you didn't do, and it is different from any other grief I've ever known. It sits in your chest like a stone. You wake up in the morning, and for just half a second you think you're somewhere else, and then you remember. What made it worse, what made it genuinely unbearable at times, was what was happening with Renata. She had come to visit me twice in the first 2 months, but Dennis had gotten to her. I don't know exactly what he said, what Charlene said, what his brother said to her, but somewhere in those months my daughter started to pull away. The calls got shorter, then infrequent, then she stopped answering. By the time I was released, 11 months in with good behavior, Renata had not spoken to me in 5 months. I came out of that facility on a Thursday morning in April. My cousin picked me up. She handed me a bag with a change of clothes, a prepaid phone, and $40. I was 55 years old. I had a felony conviction on my record. I had no savings, no car, no home. The house in Brentwood had been sold during the divorce proceedings, and Dennis had structured everything so cleverly that I walked away with almost nothing. Just enough to say the split had technically been equitable. I sat in my cousin's car in that parking lot and I cried for about 15 minutes straight. Not the quiet kind, the ugly gasping kind. And then I stopped. Because I have been a black woman in America long enough to know that crying is allowed, but you do not get to stay there. I need to tell you about Ruth, because without Ruth, none of the rest of this story happens. Ruth was my cousin's neighbor. 68 years old, retired school teacher, widow. She had a vegetable garden that took up half her backyard, and she brought squash over on Tuesday afternoons without being asked. The week I moved back in with my cousin, Ruth came by with a casserole dish and sat down at the kitchen table and just listened. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say, everything happens for a reason. She just listened. Who's also, I discovered over the following weeks, had money. Not flashy money, quiet money. She'd been investing in real estate since the 1980s, buying small rental properties in Memphis and South Haven, and she had done very well. She was sharp in ways that didn't announce themselves. About 6 weeks after I got out, Ruth asked me if I'd ever thought about property management. I told her I didn't know anything about property management. She said, "You know how to work hard and you're not afraid of difficult people. That's most of it." She gave me a job managing 2 of her rental properties. It was not glamorous. I was fixing leaky faucets, dealing with tenants who paid late, coordinating with contractors, filling out maintenance logs. I made $900 a month. But Ruth also started teaching me about how to read a lease, about what to look for in a distressed property, about the difference between a cosmetic problem and a structural one, about how the Section 8 voucher program worked and where the real opportunities were for someone who was willing to put in the work most landlords didn't want to do. I got my real estate license 14 months after I was released. I was 56 years old, studying at a folding table in my cousin's guest bedroom, taking the practice exams on a laptop with a cracked screen. I passed on the first try. I need to tell you about Renata now, about the silence. I tried. I want you to know that. I sent letters to her apartment in Atlanta, real letters, handwritten, not email. Most came back unopened. I called and left voicemails that I spent hours composing in my head, trying to find exactly the right words that didn't sound offensive, didn't sound pitying, didn't push her further away. She never called back. I found out through my cousin that Renata had gotten married, a man named Dwayne who she'd been dating since before I went in. I found out at Christmas, months after the wedding had happened. My cousin said it gently, carefully, watching my face. I nodded. I said, "I'm glad she's happy," and then I went to the bathroom and ran the water so no one would hear me. My daughter got married without me there. You can analyze all the logic you want about why it happened, how it happened, whose fault it was, but that is the sentence you come back to. My daughter got married without me there. I channeled everything into work. That is what I know how to do. By the time I was 59, I had my own property management company, Tate Property Solutions, LLC, registered in the state of Tennessee, 3 employees, 22 units under management in Memphis and DeSoto County, Mississippi. I had bought my own house, a 3-bedroom in Midtown Memphis in cash. Nothing extravagant, clean, mine. I had also, and this part took years and a very good attorney named Howard, filed a motion to have my conviction vacated. New evidence had emerged. A forensic audio analyst I hired found significant editing artifacts in the recording Dennis had submitted. The DA's office reopened the case in 2023. Dennis's story fell apart under new scrutiny. Charlene, it turned out, had her own reasons to be unhappy with Dennis. By then, he had done to her what he had done to me. She provided an affidavit. My conviction was vacated in October of 2023. The judge signed the order on a Tuesday afternoon, and my attorney called me while I was in the middle of a property inspection in Southaven. I sat down on the front steps of an empty duplex, and I read the paperwork she sent to my phone, and I just said, "Okay, okay." That's all I could manage. Okay. Dennis was ultimately indicted on charges of evidence tampering and perjury. His case moved slowly the way these things do, but it moved. He pleaded guilty in March of 2024 to avoid trial. He received 36 months of supervised probation, was ordered to pay restitution, and lost his business licenses in 2 states. He is not in prison, and yes, I have complicated feelings about that. But he is not the same man he was, and I am not the same woman. Here is how Renata found me. I had not heard from her in almost 9 years when my phone rang on a Wednesday morning last November. I was at my desk going over a lease renewal. The number was an Atlanta area code I didn't recognize. She'd changed her number at some point. I answered anyway because I always answer numbers I don't know. It's the property manager in me. There was a long pause on the line, and then her voice, older than I remembered. "Careful. Mama?" I put my hand flat on my desk to steady myself. She had seen the news coverage of my conviction being vacated. She had read the court documents. She had done what people do when they finally let themselves look at something they've been turning away from for years. She had looked at all of it. She had been sitting with it for months before she called. She said, I don't know where to start, Mama. I said, then don't start, just talk. We were on the phone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I looked at the call log afterward. At some point I moved from my desk to the kitchen floor, sitting with my back against the cabinet because my legs didn't want to hold me up anymore. She cried. I cried. She asked me questions about what had happened, about the trial, about the recording, about Dennis, and I answered all of them. I had nothing to hide. I had never had anything to hide. She told me about Dwayne, about her work at a hospital in Decatur where she was now a charge nurse. She told me she had a son, my grandson, who was 3 years old. His name was Marcus. She said his middle name was Eugene, which is a version of my name, and she started crying again when she said it, and I understood what she was telling me. She had been carrying me with her even when she was pushing me away. I flew to Atlanta in December. Renata picked me up from Hartsfield-Jackson, and when she saw me come through the terminal, she walked me fast, not running but fast, and when she put her arms around me, I couldn't speak. We just stood there in the middle of the arrivals hall, people moving around us, and I held my daughter and I thought, this is what I did all of it for. Every $14 an hour job, every exam at a folding table, every property inspection in the rain, for this exact moment. Dwayne was respectful and kind. He shook my hand and said, I've heard a lot about you, Mrs. Tate. I'm glad you're here. I could tell he meant it. And Marcus, my grandson, came running in from the backyard with grass-stained knees and looked up at me with Renata's same eyes, wide and serious, and said, Are you my Grandma Eunice? I said, I am. He held up a plastic dinosaur and said, This is a Brachiosaurus. You can hold it if you want. I held it. I held it for the rest of the evening. Here is what I want to say to anyone who is in the part of the story I was in at 55, standing in a parking lot with $40 and a felony conviction, and the daughter who won't answer the phone. I know that the math seems impossible from there. I know that the gap between where you are and where you need to be looks like it can't be crossed. But every single thing I built, the license, the company, the house, the legal fight, every single thing started with one small decision made on one ordinary day. Ruth's casserole, the folding table, the cracked laptop, the practice exam. One day at a time is a cliche because it is true. Dennis did not win. He did not win because the truth has a longer memory than a lie does. It takes longer to surface. Sometimes it is slower, more expensive, more exhausting, but it surfaces. And I want to say something about Renata, because I know some of you are in the situation where your child has been turned against you, where someone you loved used your own child as a weapon, and you are wondering if that door will ever open again. I cannot promise you it will. I cannot tell you your story ends the way mine did, but I will tell you that I never stopped writing, never stopped calling, never gave Renata reason to think she was right to walk away, even when she wasn't taking my calls. I stayed. You have to stay. Last month, Renata drove up to Memphis with Marcus for a long weekend. We went to the zoo on Saturday. Marcus held my hand the entire time because he explained, in charge of keeping me safe. We stood in front of the giraffe exhibit for a long time. He was convinced the giraffe could understand him if he spoke slowly enough. And Renata stood next to me with her shoulder touching mine. And she said quietly, I'm sorry, Mama. I'm still sorry. I said, I know, baby. I know. And we watched my 3-year-old grandson try to have a conversation with a giraffe. And I thought, I am 63 years old. I have been to jail. I have been betrayed by a man I loved, and by a system that should have protected me, and for a period of years by my own daughter. I have worked jobs that broke my back and studied for exams when I was too tired to see straight, and fought a legal battle that took 6 years to win. And I'm standing in the Memphis Zoo on a Saturday afternoon, holding my grandson's hand, watching a giraffe, and the sun is out, and my daughter is next to me. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. I think about the parking lot a lot, the one outside the Shelby County Correctional Center on a Thursday morning in April, with $40 in my pocket and a cousin who didn't say much on the drive home. That parking lot is where I could have decided the story was over. Nobody would have blamed me. I was 55 years old with a felony on my record and a daughter who wouldn't answer the phone. The math didn't add up to anything hopeful. But here is what I've come to understand about the way life actually works. Not the way we wish it worked, not the fairy tale version, but the real mechanics of it. What you do in the quiet moments nobody sees is exactly what determines what happens in the loud moments everybody does. Dennis built his lies carefully over months in private, and they worked for a while. But a lie is a structure built on sand, and I've lived long enough to watch what happens when the tide comes in. It comes in slow, but it comes. I didn't get my life back because I was lucky. I got it back because Ruth handed me a casserole and an opportunity, and I chose to show up the next morning. And the morning after that, there is nothing glamorous about studying for a real estate exam at a folding table when you're 56 years old and exhausted and grieving. There is no moment in that process that feels like a turning point. You just keep going because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is the one thing I refuse to do. That stubbornness, that refusal to let what happened to me become the end of my story, that is something nobody gave me. I had to choose it, over and over, on days when it didn't feel worth choosing. That is what I want people to hear when they hear mine. Not that I was special, that I was stubborn, that I showed up, that I kept my integrity intact even when Dennis was dragging my name through the mud, even when Renata wasn't taking my calls, even when the system failed me completely. I did not become the person they accused me of being. That mattered. It mattered more than I understood at the time. And then there is the matter of understanding, of being smart enough, not just in the book sense, but in the practical sense of learning how things actually work and using that knowledge to build something real. Ruth didn't just give me a job. She taught me how to think about money, about property, about the long game. I paid attention. I asked questions. I didn't let pride or shame stop me from learning from a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher with squash in her garden, because wisdom doesn't announce itself with a title. Renata called me because the truth surfaced. It always does. Dennis signed a guilty plea because the evidence caught up with him. That is not luck or fate. That is the natural consequence of a life built on deception colliding with a life built on something solid. I am not standing in the Memphis Zoo on a Saturday holding my grandson's hand because things worked out. I am standing there because I did not quit, because I kept my word to myself, because I chose to build something true even when everything around me was burning. That is the only secret I have. Keep going. Stay honest. Pay attention. The rest takes care of itself.